Hello, dear friends. My name is Vasyl Pekhno. I'm a Ukrainian journalist, and I invite all of you to watch this latest update on Ukrainian battle map situation as of August the 16th. So please like this video. Don't forget to share it, subscribe to this YouTube channel where you watch this video, and leave your comments just below the video. So it doesn't matter what was agreed between Trump and Putin yesterday. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect on Ukrainian battlefield because the war is ongoing. So I will describe what is going on during in this, parallel universe when on the one hand some negotiations are being provided, but on the other hand, really cruel actions on the battlefield are also taking actions. So I will tell you guys what is going on Ukrainian battlefields right now in the next 15 or 17 minutes, something like this. Let's begin. By the way, don't forget to subscribe and leave your likes. So Dobropillia and the breakthrough that the occupiers organized at the beginning of this week have essentially been eliminated. The enemy's advance here has basically been halted. This has been officially reported by the National Guard Corps AZOV. They came out last night, actually in the evening, around 9 o'clock, with an official statement that the enemy's losses over 3 days of the operation amounted to 385 people, of whom 270 were killed, 101 wounded, and another 13 were taken prisoner. But just think about that number for a moment. 385 people. That's already battalion-level numbers, in fact. That's the number of occupiers who were killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in the Dobropillia direction as a result of Azov's operations. And it's important to understand once again, this is not just the Azov Brigade, it's the Azov Corps. The Azov Corps, along with all the attached units, subordinate and adjacent units, all of them stopped the enemy's advance. What are these units, these formations? Let me name them for you. These are the 79th Air Assault Brigade, the 82nd as well, which obviously were redeployed. Specifically, the 82nd was moved from the Sumy region to address these critical situations that arose in the Dobropillia direction. These are units of the 1st and 425th Assault Regiments, the 25th Separate Assault Battalion, the 2nd Battalion of the 92nd Separate Assault Brigade, the 32nd Separate Mechanized Brigade, the 38th Marine Brigade, and the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. So this is a very powerful and serious force made up of units that operated here. The 93rd also, as a result of this operation, demonstrated how it eliminated the enemy in its area of responsibility. What is also interesting is that the Kholodny Yar Brigade stated that they made very active use of robotic ground systems. Here you can see the premises of the UGS and the operation of its strike UGS, which they used during this operation. Therefore, it can be said that settlements such as Shruzke have indeed been cleared and liberated from the enemy. In particular, this is, by the way, the achievement of the 93rd Brigade, Shruzke. Also the settlement of Vesele. Here as well, the 93rd Brigade was operating. Zoloti, Kolodiaz, and Rubizhna have been cleared of the enemy. There were also reports about the liberation of Vilna, Novoshachove, and Nikonorivka. These are further south, Nikonorivka and Suketske to be precise. By the way, which is also very important, Suketske already has an impact on Rodinske. All these settlements have been liberated by the defense forces of our country. And this is thanks to the efforts of numerous units and the timely response of our troops to what happened. Here is Shachov as well, right here. It too has been cleared of the enemy. By the way, it's worth noting that the 82nd Air Assault Brigade, which is operating in this area, is engaging the enemy in Popovye Yar to prevent them from advancing further toward the Kostiantinivka direction. In other words, the enemy is being blocked. Their main forces, the 110,000 personnel, as we know from the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Alexander Syrsky, that it is precisely 110,000 troops operating here on the enemy's side. And you might think it would already be possible to breathe a sigh of relief, but as they say, not quite. It's still a bit too early, because although the Russians have lost their advantage until the situation is fully stabilized, it's not worth saying that, well, okay, maybe stabilization has been achieved, but it's too soon to talk about success, because the situation actually remains quite difficult. The Russians continue to send additional resources here and have significantly ramped up their drone units, which were already operating in this sector, but now they've reinforced them even more, to the fullest extent. First and foremost, I'm talking about the elite Russian UAV units, such as Rubicon, Judgment Day, and Judgment Night. These are all, in fact, footage from them. This footage is from Rubicon. It's quite a significant pain in the neck, so to speak, striking precisely at those crucial targets that actually provide us with a substantial technological advantage: essential communication equipment, vital communication antennas, and the formidable Baba Yaga. A lot of Baba Yaga type drones, our bombers, mostly these are vampire bombers. They are actually taking them out. They've found a way to counter them. So in a way, these are anti-aircraft drones operated by Rubicon. I want to emphasize this is enemy footage from the Russian UAV group Rubicon, which once again is deployed here to operate in the Pokrovsk and Dobropillia directions and unfortunately is causing us a lot of trouble. So this also needs to be taken into account. The situation is it's still a bit too early to say that everything is a success, a victory, and that everything is super, super great. But in fact, even those actions, absolutely heroic ones, that our troops have managed to achieve all these changes, all these intricacies, you can see how the blue lines of regained control are intertwined with the red dots. Obviously, at this point, we can assume that Kucherev Yar does not appear anywhere as a liberated location. In other words, the enemy is still very much present here, and now, cut off from logistics, they will be driven out and destroyed. Russian social media is making a lot of noise about this, loudly claiming that the 55th Motorized Rifle Regiment has simply been abandoned to its fate. And in fact, well, really at the brigade level, I think the occupiers will suffer losses in the near future this week. So the situation is indeed improving, but with a lot of caveats. Although, by the way, it's worth noting that in fact, the defensive line here near Dobropillia looks pretty much the same as it does in many other sections of the front. So the positions are interwoven like this. Somewhere it's us, somewhere it's them. Everything is all tangled up like this, one after another. They're on top, we're below, and it's like that all the time. All of this is because the lines aren't dense and because drone technologies are at work, because drones now, as I've said dozens, even hundreds of times, have changed the nature of war. And to be honest, just like in Dobropillia, for example, there were positions in Bilohorivka on the Siversky direction that existed for months, where there were even situations when our soldiers were underground while the occupiers were above ground. And this is actually a very common practice. That's why high quality reconnaissance, a clear understanding of where the enemy is and where our own forces are, as well as effective coordination and organization of the defense, this is in fact a huge achievement. Not many in our military can provide this at a high level. Azov can. Azov can, and in fact, Azov is doing exactly that. In Pokrovsk, by the way, it's also worth noting some good news because the 7th Air Assault Corps is operating here. By the way, the 7th Corps includes, if I'm not mistaken, the 82nd Brigade, the 25th is operating here, and the 79th, although it doesn't belong to the 7th Air Assault Corps, is here as a unit assigned under the command of the 1st Corps of the National Guard Azov. But in Pokrovsk, the 7th Corps of the National Guard, the Air Assault Forces, announced that the city has been completely cleared of occupiers. They showed a video of our soldiers moving through the city. All those groups, all those individual Russians who entered the city have all been eliminated. Right now, Ukrainian servicemen are operating in the city completely, thoroughly, and totally, and local residents are moving about. However, in general, movement around Pokrovsk is still quite restricted. And despite these restrictions, it is still possible to get into the city thanks to our paratroopers. It's also worth noting, by the way, that not only the air assault forces are operating there, but also assault regiments like Skala, which have distinguished themselves both up north near Dobropillia and here down south in the city of Pokrovsk itself, which is now completely cleared of occupiers. But I'll repeat, the Russians are not lagging behind. They're not just sitting back. They will still exert tremendous pressure here because reserves are now being redirected here from the Kursk region. This section of the front is constantly being reinforced as it is the main point of attack from the enemy. I really hope that this Dobropillia story, which is not over yet but is already close to some kind of happy ending, that it ended with what's called an auto-reaction review. That is, when all our mistakes and shortcomings that occurred during this kind of defense will be reviewed and analyzed. What can be done better, who can do it better, how to pass on information, all these things will be analyzed. Because our grassroots initiative must be honest and fair. And this grassroots initiative is, in fact, what the entire Ukrainian military relies on. And it is precisely within this initiative, let's say, the decentralization of the military, including in the area of procurement, that yesterday the government, through the Ministry of Defense and Denis Shmihal, who is our Minister of Defense, implemented a policy whereby brigades will now receive increased decentralized funding to purchase whatever they need at that very moment on the battlefield for their own needs. These include drones, ground robotic systems, electronic warfare equipment, and according to the government's latest decisions, vehicles, and also increased payments for each brigade. In other words, the more a brigade fights, the more battalions it has engaged in combat, the more funds it will receive. Now, for each battalion engaged in combat, the brigade's leadership will receive 7 million hryvnias. Previously, regardless of how many battalions in a unit were engaged in combat, it received 27 million hryvnias per month. This was a decision by the deputy head of the president's office, Pavlo, who came in and implemented this initiative. It was prompted by the president, but he developed and designed the implementation mechanism so that now, since December of last year, each brigade receives 27 million hryvnias every month. Now, they will receive 7 million for each battalion. So theoretically, if, for example, a brigade has 7 battalions engaged in combat, it will receive 49 million hryvnias. Yes, Shmyhal said that yesterday 4.3 billion hryvnias were allocated to meet the needs of our brigades, for all fighting battalions. Until recently, this amount was about 1.5 billion per month. Now it's 4.3 billion. In my opinion, these are excellent changes that are happening, and this is what we should focus on, because commanders on the ground know best what kind of drones they need, what vehicles they require, when, how many, and which NPKs. Well, of course, there is room for abuse here, but even with that, let's say, it can be managed with proper inspections. However, let's get back to the front, to Pokrovsk specifically.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism, and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
There is good news here. You know, it's very rare when we can actually share good news about what's happening at the front. But now let's talk about the bad news, because in reality, we do have some bad news in the Novopavlivka direction, because the enemy has advanced recently in several directions. In particular, this is in the area of the settlement of Zeleny Kut. This is the border between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. Essentially, right now, along the entire administrative border between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions, the enemy has reached the boundary. In some places, they have crossed this border, particularly here in Temirivka. This is already the Zaporizhzhia region. By the way, in the Zaporizhzhia region, this Temirivka poses a rather serious threat of further movement by Russian troops. If we don't stop them here, soon we'll feel the enemy threatening the rear of the Huliaipol direction, and that's Zaporizhzhia. This is the announced summer-autumn campaign, the enemy's offensive that the president spoke about. That's why at this moment we must pay close attention, because Huliaipol, Orikhiv, Kamyanske, Vasylivka, these 3 districts of Zaporizhzhia region, where the enemy will soon continue its active offensive campaign, must now be under special attention. Right now, at this moment in Zaporizhzhia, what's happening is essentially a test by battle. Near Huliaipol, Malitok, and Masivske in the Orikhiv direction, this is a test by battle. But from Novopavlivka, we could face serious problems for Zaporizhzhia if we don't pay attention to them, especially here near Temirivka. But let's go back north to the Novopavlivka area. This is where we have the borders with Dnipropetrovsk region. Here in Zeleny Kut, the enemy has advanced. The enemy has advanced in the area of Oleksandrivhrad, and the enemy, according to OSINT sources, has also advanced in the area of Iskra. Iskra, by the way, is the old name of the settlement. Now it is called Andriivka Klevtsova. I'll repeat once more, Iskra is the old name, but that's how it appears on the deep state map. And the day before yesterday, there were these kinds of shots here, which OSINT analysts identified as evidence that throughout the settlement on the eastern, to be precise, bank of the river that flows here in the eastern part of this settlement, Andriivka Klevtsova, Russians had spread out their flags in many locations. And this widespread display, although we know they have a common practice called flag sticking, where you come, stick your flag in, and quickly run away so that, well, a drone can film you, take a picture, record a video, and then a propaganda video can be shown claiming that you have captured this or that settlement. They have already practiced this even on a large scale. At one point, they raised about 11 flags in different parts of Chasiv Yar, which does not reflect reality. I mean, regarding the actual securing and holding of the settlement, Chasiv Yar. In Andriivka, Klitsova, and Klitsov as well, the occupiers hung up at least 5 of their rags in different places and are trying to convince everyone that they are present there. Well, we'll keep watching to see how the situation develops, whether it really turns out that there are occupiers in Iskra or Andriivka, Klitsove, because if they are there, unfortunately, folks, that's bad news, since Andriivka, Klitsova and the settlements beyond it, already in the Dnipropetrovsk region, like Havrilivka and Pithavrilivka, would be affected. These areas are just like in the case of Dobropillia and Zoloty Kolodyaz. Remember when there was an uproar about the enemy advancing near Dobropillia, and it was said that if the enemy managed to gain a foothold there, they might entrench themselves in the positions and engineering fortification structures that our command had been building since the beginning of this year, taking into account all the realities of modern drone warfare. These are really excellent fortifications that, in principle, are supposed to become an immovable wall between good and evil. So these threats near Dobropillia have been eliminated. The occupiers have been driven out of those engineering and fortification structures. But Andriivka, Klevtsova, that is Iskra, Havrilivka, and Pidhavrilivka, are exactly that same line of defense, just further south. And here, too, we need to pay very close attention and carefully monitor the situation to prevent the enemy from taking these positions. Because the further trend, where the fighting gradually moves into the Dnipropetrovsk region, a place where there has never been war before, is dangerous. These trends are concerning, because there, in the Dnipropetrovsk region, it's all steppes. There's no urbanized Donbas, no densely populated areas where it's easier to hold back the enemy than it would be in Dnipropetrovsk. In the Dnipropetrovsk region, it will be more difficult because you would have to retreat from one settlement to another over much greater distances. Dnipropetrovsk is not as densely populated as Donetsk, so this needs to be taken into account, and there are certain risks here. Here, by the way, are some photos of what I'm talking about. You can see the yellow stripes, the yellow lines. These are all engineering and fortification structures, which in some places the Russians are digging into along our new defensive lines. And you can see that in the Dnipropetrovsk region, if this line is breached, there aren't such dense and continuous lines. Except perhaps the next one, all the way near Pavlograd, in terms of circular defense. So this danger definitely needs to be taken into account. Well, friends, I think I'll wrap it up here. That's our summary for this week. It's a mix of positives and negatives. There are positive moments and there are negative ones. But in any case, I'll lean toward the positive if you support us with likes, leave a comment, and subscribe. Take care of yourselves, all the best, and see you next time.